Hi, welcome back. All right, so now we're going to take a look at Ozymandias by Percy Shelley and word for word, line by line, to determine what it is that the poet is saying. First line, I met a traveler from an antique land. Of course, what probably stands out is the word antique, since we just encountered that with the last thing that we read, hidden teacher. And we know from that that antique has a connotation of something valuable and something that's old and ancient. So let's look at who's talking in this line. It's very fascinating to pinpoint who our narrator is and who's telling the story. In Hidden Teacher, it's pretty straightforward. It was done in first person. It was done I, and the I is the scientist, which is one of two characters in the piece. This poem, even though it's only 14 lines, is way more complicated. In fact, you'll probably see that there's 5 speakers that are telling us this story. First off, we start with I. Now we have to make sure that we don't get confused with I being the author. I is a narrator. I is not Percy Shelley, who probably did not go to Thebes and meet a traveler. Instead, he's writing a story about a narrator named I who meets a traveler. So in the first line there, we have I, and then we have a traveler. The traveler is the one who's telling us the beginning of the story. It's in quotes. 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone. So it's the traveler who tells the narrator about what he found in Thebes. And what he finds is a statue. Not just a statue, but trunkless legs of stone and a visage, which is half sunken into the sand. And on the visage, there is a frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer of cold command. So now we're getting information from the stone statue itself. Even though it's partly shattered, we know a lot about what this is. It's got a frown, so it's not happy. It's got a wrinkled lip, so probably old. A sneer of cold command, which of course, designates authority, and not a very kind authority either. And what these marks on the statue convey to us, that Shelley makes clear, it's telling us about the sculpture, not just about the person that it is sculpted of. And it tells us that the sculptor himself had passions about what it was that he was making, because he's the one who carved into it that sneer of cold command, and that artist is the one who carved into it the wrinkled lip and the frown. So he's conveying, the artist is, his rendition of what it is that it is making art of. And it has survived long past the living flesh of the Ramsey, of the form that it was actually depicting. The next line is confusing, and it's one that stumped readers for many years. It says, the hand that mocked them, I can't read it there, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. What hand and heart are we talking about? Probably that of the sculptor, because it is the hand of the sculptor that is able to mock whatever its subject is. And the heart that fed, again, maybe the artist, maybe it's the artist's heart that feeds the generations to come about his passions. Not sure about that. You might have your own understanding of what the heart that fed means. Then we go on further. And if you look at the structure of this poem, it's done in 14 lines, which is the structure of a sonnet, in which the first 8 usually set up, in this case, it sets up the story, gives us our characters and our place. In the second 6 lines, we have the words that are coming from the pedestal, which are the words from Ozymandias himself. So we've had I, we've had the traveler, we've had the stone, we've had the artist, and now we have Ozymandias speaking. So that's a lot of people and stone telling us the story. It's on the pedestal. It's an inscription by Ozymandias in which he says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So in other words, what he's accomplished, the civilization, the city that he is standing in when the sculptor makes his sculpture, is vast, it's immense, it's amazing, it's powerful, it's mighty. Look at it in despair. But what have we got instead? We look around. Now, the last 3 lines, we're not sure who's narrating this for us? It could be the traveler. It could be the I who is paraphrasing this story or what the traveler said. But what we get is a omniscient understanding of this landscape. Even though those are the words coming from Ozymandias, nothing remains. Around that decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, all that's left are the sands, the desert, lone and level. And what do? They stretch far away for infinity. So what Percy Shelley is telling us is that as great and as powerful as leaders might be, what is left in years to come is not their works, is not the man-made stuff of material, but it's only nature, which in itself changes also, because what the sound was back then is not the sound that stands there and blows today. So that is what Percy Shelley is telling us in this poem. So now let's look at what we've got when we move over to Horace Smith. Okay, so we're going to go back to this video and hear Horace Smith's poem.
In Egypt's sandy silence, all alone, stands a gigantic leg, which far off throws the only shadow that the desert knows. I am great Ozymandias, saith the stone, the king of kings. This mighty city shows the wonders of my hand. The city's gone, naught but the leg remaining to disclose the site of this forgotten Babylon. We wonder, and some hunter may express wonder like ours, when through the wilderness where London stood, holding the wolf in chase, he meets some fragment huge, and stops to guess what powerful but unrecorded race once dwelt in that annihilated place.
Okay, so a bit of a different poem there. What we're dealing with now is Hi. All right, so this is his poem on a stupendous leg of granite. And what we're dealing with this is a little bit different. It kind of seems like he must have read Percy Shelley's, because there's a lot of similarity. He starts off where Shelley ends, in Egypt's sandy silence all alone. One thing that you might notice about his poem is that it's not as lyrical, it's not as poetic as what Shelley was giving us. It's more direct and it's more casual. So he's telling us straight off, in Egypt's sandy silence all alone, there stands a gigantic leg. There's no vastness or trunklessness involved. It's just a big leg, which far off throws the only shadow that the desert knows. And we have again up front the words from Ozymandias instead of at the end. I am great Ozymandias, saith the stone, the king of kings. This mighty city shows the wonders of my hand. I wonder, since it's coming from a pedestal, why the words are a little slightly different. They are. Again, the city's gone, the same thing that Shelley says. What's remaining? The leg is remaining. Yes. Naught but the leg remaining to disclose the site of that forgotten Babylon. Same message that Shelley's giving, and that's a very lyrical, poetic line, probably the most in that statement. And again, in those first 8 lines, we have the setup. He's doing the same thing in terms of a sonnet, and in the 6th, we change. In fact, we go now from a narrator's story in Egypt's sandy silence and the words from the stone to we wonder. Who's we? The reader? The person who's looking on this excavation? And some hunter may express wonder like ours. Now, okay, that's interesting. Who's this hunter? That's a new character. Is that similar to the traveler in Shelley's? This hunter could be somebody who's just wandering the landscapes and comes across this thing like the traveler did. or the hunter could almost be a poet who's wondering and trying to make sense of this. Some hunter may express wonder like ours, when through the wilderness where London stood. So there's a very specific name of London in here, which Shelley does not do. And remember, at that time, I emphasized that London, or England, was involved in expanding their British Empire and was colonizing, as I said, British Empire, yeah. So not too different from what Egypt was doing in 1250 BC. Perhaps what Horace Smith is doing here is relating that to London and maybe giving a lesson to England there, in that be careful, that which is man-made, that at one time you think is the most powerful thing on the globe, will soon fade away, and it will not last, because what will only last will be nature, nothing that man does. He meets some fragmented huge and stops to guess what wonderful but unrecorded race. That's a frightening thing, an entire race, an entire civilization not recorded and is forgotten, and the place itself is annihilated. So, and both poems are doing the same thing. Perhaps the difference, again, sorry about that. Perhaps the difference is that Horace is relating it directly and speaking to London and saying, beware, you could be like Ozymandias yourself. And Shelley is looking at it more poetically and in terms of a philosophical statement about civilization and mankind. But the two of them are saying the same thing. And we only got to that by, again, close reading, and nothing very special, just word for word and stopping and making sense. What I find most fascinating, though, is the point of view of Shelley's poem. We're going to be talking about point of view a lot because it actually, the voice, the narration of a particular story figures in way more than you might think it does. So that's kind of fascinating. We'll do that in a little bit. Did want to tell you a little story, though, which I think is fascinating. It's related to Percy Shelley. So he was born and he was raised in most of his stuff in England. However, there was a time where he took a vacation to Lercy, which is on the Italian coast there. I can't show you a picture of it now because it's very touristy, but back when he went, it looked like that. It was very wild. And in fact, the house that he stayed in was right up against the waters, and the rain and the storms and the waves would rush up against the actual facade of the place where he stayed. And you know who he was married to? He was married to Mary Shelley. In case you don't know, she wrote Frankenstein. And both of them had very high imaginations. They were both very intelligent. So they go on vacation to Lercy, which Mary did not want to do because she felt there was something odd that was going to happen. And they went with her stepsister and her husband, who had left their 5-year-old daughter in an orphanage right before they went so that they could join in this vacation. And Percy thought he was going to write a new poem when he got there. That's what he was excited about. Mary felt something else was going to happen. She had already had 3 miscarriages, and when she got to Lercy in April, she realized she was pregnant. And again, she miscarried. She almost died from it. Percy sat her in a tub of cold ice, which I didn't know that would stop the bleeding, but apparently after 7 hours it stopped her bleeding. But then he started imagining things like dead children rising from the ocean and him strangling his wife. At the same time, the stepsister of Mary Shelley had found out that her daughter died of fever in the orphanage. So there was a lot of grief and kind of horror going on in the house at that time. Meanwhile, Percy, who was 27 years old at that time, he had challenged Byron, Lord Byron, who was another poet, to a race on a sailboat across that treacherous water. It was supposed to happen in a couple weeks. He had taken off on a sailboat with William, who was the husband of the stepsister, and a kid from the town named Charles, and they left and they went down the beach a little bit. And then when they were getting ready to come back, a storm ensued, and fishermen warned them not to take the journey, but they decided to do it anyway. They didn't make it. And about 10 days later, Percy Shelley's body washed up. And the only reason they knew it was him because all of the life in the waters had pretty much decayed and eaten up his flesh. But there was a poem book in his pocket by Keats. So that's how they knew it was him. William's body they never found, and they never found Charles's body. But it was pretty devastating. And what they did at the time, they could not export his body for burial in England because there was a plague. So there were strict rules, and they had to bury him in Italy. But then they went back in August. So that was done in like July, and they went back in August, and they put his body on a pyre to burn it. This is kind of fascinating, right? This is a painting that was done a few years later by Louis Edouard Fournier in 1889. One thing you'll see in the back of the PowerPoint and the painting is a woman kneeling down. That is supposed to be a depiction of Mary Shelley, which is unusual because women were not allowed to go to funerals back then because they thought that it would be too psychologically and emotionally devastating for them, which they made it worse because there was no closure for them when somebody died. But Fournier put her in this painting. He was burned. Everything about him was burned except one thing. It was his heart. And so they wrapped his heart. His heart didn't burn. So they wrapped his heart in a piece of silk, and they gave it to Mary Shelley, who kept it in her pencil box. I don't know what happened to it. It may have been the impetus for her to write Frankenstein. I don't know. But I thought that that was kind of an interesting story. So he died at the age of 28. But hopefully what you got mostly from that, aside from the tale, is close reading with literature. And we're going to go do a little bit more of that in a writing, I think, in a piece of writing. So thank you for tuning in.